A man walks into the dark with a loaded gun, ready to protect what the law says is his. What he finds instead stops him cold. Not a thief, a mother, two starving children, and a fistful of feed corn. In that moment, every rule he ever lived by shatters. Stay with me. This one will reach right into your chest. Like, share, subscribe, and don't move.
The frost was thick that morning. October in the Texas Hill Country didn't ease in. It arrived with a bite. Silas Vance stood by the empty corral, his breath plumed white in the gray light. He didn't need to count the cattle left in the lower pasture. He already knew the number. Too few. He didn't need to check his ledger either. He knew the debt, $2,400. Money he hadn't spent, but money he owed, because he had put his name on a piece of paper for a friend. The friend ran. The paper stayed. Emma Thorne drove up just past dawn. The buggy wheels crunched loud on the frozen dirt. Amos wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who carried paper for the bank. And the bank didn't care about frost, or empty corrals, or a widower's pride. Amos didn't get out of the buggy. He just leaned down. 45 days, Silas. His voice was tired. I'm sorry, I truly am. Silas didn't flinch. He looked at the horse, then at Amos. How much to hold it off? 800, by December 15th, if you can make that. Amos looked away, staring toward the horizon. The bank takes the eastern 60, the creek, the old cabin. All of it. Silas gave a slow nod. He didn't plead. A man signed his name. He bore the weight. That was the rule. The law was a rigid, unforgiving thing. But it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Martha was 3 years in the ground. His son was gone to the east, chasing a life that didn't smell like dust and failure. All Silas had left was the deed in his lockbox, the legal right to stand on this dirt and call it his. Amos tipped his hat and drove away. Silas watched the buggy until it was just a speck. Then he turned, walked to the barn, and saddled his horse. He needed to appraise the timber on the eastern 60. If he was going to lose it, he needed to know what it was worth. By noon, the wind had picked up. It howled through the bare branches of the pecans down by the creek. Silas rode slow. This was the best piece of land he owned. Good water, good soil, and an old root cellar built under a rotting trapper's cabin. He kept his winter feed out here. Dried corn, seed potatoes, things that needed to stay dry and cold. He tied his horse to a dead stump and walked up to the cabin. Right away, something was wrong. The dirt near the cellar doors was disturbed. Silas crouched down. He ran a calloused thumb over the rim of a footprint. It wasn't a boot. The sole was smooth, completely worn through and small. He stood up and looked at the cellar doors. The heavy iron padlock hung loose. The hasp had been pried out of the rotting wood with a crowbar. Silas stared at the broken lock. A quiet, cold anger started to pool in his chest. It wasn't about the corn. It was about the line drawn in the dirt. He was a man being bled dry by the bank, by the law, by the weather. He had played by the rules. He was losing everything because he followed the rules. And now, someone was stepping onto his property, breaking his lock, and taking what little he had left. A man's property was his name. You let someone take from it, you let them take your dignity. The law said this was his. He had the right to defend it. He had to defend it. If he didn't, he was nothing. He didn't go into the cellar. He saw the tracks leading out. They had taken a sack already, but they would be back. Thieves always came back when the taking was easy. Silas mounted his horse. He rode back to the main house. He waited for the sun to drop. When the house went pitch black, Silas lit a single oil lamp. He walked over to his desk. He pulled out his heavy leather bag. The leather was scarred stiff from years of hard use. He packed it with deliberate, heavy movements. First, a new padlock, then a heavy iron hammer. Finally, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out his Colt revolver. He checked the cylinder. Heavy brass cartridges caught the lamplight. He snapped the cylinder shut. It made a sharp, metallic click, the sound of authority, the sound of a man protecting what was legally his. He dropped the heavy gun into the leather bag. Silas blew out the lamp. He stepped out into the biting October night. The wind hit his face, but he didn't feel the cold. He gripped the thick handle of the leather bag. It weighed him down. It felt like the weight of the deed itself. He began the long walk toward the Eastern 60. He was going to catch a thief. He was going to stand his ground, because in Silas Vancest's world, property was sacred, and a man who stole it had to pay the price. He didn't know it yet, but the rigid world he was walking out to defend was about to shatter. The walk to the eastern boundary was 2 miles of hard, frozen earth. Silas didn't take a horse. He wanted to feel the ground. He wanted to move quiet. The wind died down right around midnight. The stillness left the cold hanging in the air like a blade. His boots broke the frost with a sharp, steady crunch. He carried the lantern unlit in his left hand. In his right, he carried the heavy leather bag. The Colt inside thumped against his thigh through the thick leather. It was a heavy, reassuring rhythm. The law, the rules, the right of a man to keep what was his. The old trapper's cabin loomed up against the night sky. It was just a black shape against lesser black. The roof was caved in on one side. The real value was underneath, the root cellar. Silas stopped 50 yards out. He listened, nothing but the creek trickling over ice-slicked rocks. He moved closer. He set the bag down softly in the frost. He pulled a match from his coat, struck it sharp against his thumbnail, and lit the lantern. The yellow light flared, pushing back the dark. He picked up the bag. He stepped up to the cellar doors. The broken padlock hung useless on the wood. Silas didn't draw the gun. He didn't figure he needed to. He was a big man, and anger makes a man look bigger. He planted his boot against the heavy wooden doors and kicked. The doors banged open. They hit the dirt with a loud, violent crack. Silas stepped down into the cellar. He raised the lantern high. "All right?" His voice was a low gravel, meant to stop a man in his tracks. "Get up." The light hit the far corner. Silas froze. He expected drifters. He expected desperate, hardened men with knives or cheap pistols. He expected a fight. He didn't get one. There were 3 of them, pressed back against the cold dirt wall. They flinched away from the sudden light. A woman, 2 children. The woman was on her knees in the dirt. She threw her arms out, pulling the 2 small bodies behind her. She made herself a shield. Her dress was mud-stained and threadbare. Her face was hollowed out by hunger, all sharp angles and shadows. But her eyes were wide, terrified, and completely wild, like a trapped wolf. In her right hand, pressed hard against her chest, she held a fistful of dried feed corn. Silas looked at the corn. It was meant for horses, for hogs. It was rock hard. You had to boil it for half a day, just to soften it enough for an animal to chew. He looked at the boy behind her, 9, maybe, skinny as a fence rail. The girl was younger, burying her face in the woman's skirt, shaking so hard Silas could hear her teeth chattering. The heavy leather bag pulled at Silas's arm. Inside was a padlock to lock them out. Inside was a gun to drive them off. Inside was the law. The woman didn't beg for mercy. She didn't cry. She stared into the lantern light, her chest heaving. Her knuckles were white around the kernels of feed. She swallowed hard. Her voice was cracked, rough from the cold. "Please don't take our food," she whispered. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. Our food. She wasn't looking at a man who had caught a thief. She was looking at a monster who was going to take away her children's last meal, a meal fit for a beast. The silence stretched. It was heavy and suffocating. Silas Vance was a man built on rules. You work hard. You pay your debts. You protect your own. That was the framework of his entire life. But looking at the woman huddled in the dirt, the framework cracked. Right and wrong didn't matter in this cellar. Property didn't matter. The bank didn't matter. There was only a starving mother and a man holding a heavy bag. Silas looked down at his right hand. The grip on the leather handles was tight. His knuckles ached. He let go. The heavy bag hit the dirt floor with a dull, heavy thud. The sound echoed in the small space. The woman flinched, pulling the children tighter. Silas didn't look at the bag again. He walked past them, giving them a wide berth so he wouldn't crowd them. He set the lantern on an overturned crate. He walked over to the old stone fire pit built into the far wall. The ashes were dead, but there was dry wood stacked nearby. Silas knelt down. He started laying kindling. The woman didn't move. She watched him, unblinking. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her voice shook, just a little. Silas struck a match. He touched it to the dry moss. The flame caught, yellow and warm. "You can't eat that corn," Silas said. His voice was quiet now. "The gravel was gone. It'll break your children's teeth. It'll tear up their insides." He stood up. He walked back to the leather bag. He unbuckled the straps. The woman tensed, waiting for the gun. Silas reached past the cold iron of the Colt. He reached past the padlock. He pulled out a waxed paper parcel. He walked back to the fire. He unwrapped the parcel. Thick slabs of salted pork, a half-dozen potatoes, an onion. He pulled a rusted iron skillet from the wall, wiped it clean with his sleeve, and set it over the growing flames. He took his hunting knife and started slicing the meat. The fat hit the hot iron. It hissed. The smell of cooking pork filled the damp cellar. He heard a small gasp from the corner. The little girl peeked out from the skirt, her eyes fixed on the skillet. The boy swallowed loudly. "Come to the fire," Silas said. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the meat. "It's too cold over there." The woman hesitated. Then, slowly, she rose. She kept herself between Silas and the children. She guided them to the fire. They sat in the dirt, the heat washing over their faces. Silas handed the woman his canteen. "Drink." Slow. She took it. She gave it to the girl first, then the boy. Then she drank. Silas cut the potatoes and tossed them in the fat. They cooked in silence. The only sound was the crackle of the wood and the hiss of the food. When it was done, Silas found 2 old tin plates. He divided the food. He gave 1 plate to the boy, 1 to the girl. He handed his own fork to the woman. "Eat," he said. They ate like starving animals, fast, desperate, burning their mouths, but not caring. Silas just watched the fire. He didn't eat. When the plates were scraped clean, the cellar felt different. The terror was gone. The heavy, desperate edge of starvation had been blunted, just for the night. The woman wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at Silas. The wildness in her eyes was replaced by a deep, weary confusion. "Who are you?" she asked. "Silas Vance. This is my land." She closed her eyes for a second. A tremor ran through her shoulders. She knew what that meant. "I'm Clara," she said quietly. "Clara Hayes. These are Abigail and Caleb." She looked at the empty tin plates, then at the heavy leather bag by the door. "You caught us," Clara said. It was a statement of fact. "You have the right to fetch the county sheriff, or shoot us where we sit." Silas picked up a stick. He poked the fire, sending up a shower of orange sparks. "The law says I do," Silas said slow. He kept his eyes on the flames. The law says a man's property is his lifeblood. Says I got a right to protect it. He turned his head. He looked straight into Clara's eyes. But no one deserves to starve on land where living folks breathe. That ain't state law, ma'am. That's just the bare minimum right of a human being. A piece of paper from the courthouse don't mean a damn thing if a man lets children freeze to death over a bushel of feed corn. Clara stared at him. She didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't the way the world worked out here. It wasn't the way men with land talked to people with nothing. We don't have money to pay you back, she said softly. I didn't ask for money. Then what do you want? Silas looked at the two kids. They were warm now. Abigail was leaning against her mother, her eyes drooping. I've got a main house 2 miles west, Silas said. There's an annex attached to it. Used to be for hands, but I don't have hands anymore. It's got a stove. It's got beds. It's got a roof that doesn't leak. He stood up. He walked over to his bag and picked it up. It didn't feel as heavy anymore. Tomorrow morning, you pack whatever you have, Silas said. You come to the main house. You keep the annex clean. You cook the meals. You do that, and you earn your keep. And your kids don't eat feed corn anymore. He didn't wait for her to agree. He didn't ask if she wanted charity. He knew she wouldn't take it. He offered her a trade, sweat for bread. It was the only currency people like them understood. Sun comes up at 6, Silas said from the doorway. Don't be late. He walked out into the cold night, leaving the lantern behind. The sun was just breaking the horizon when they walked into the yard. Silas was already at the woodpile. He had the axe swinging in a steady, metered rhythm. Rise, fall, crack. Rise, fall, crack. He didn't stop when he saw them. He didn't make a fuss. Clara carried a single battered canvas sack. It held everything she owned in the world. Caleb held Abigail's hand. They looked small in the vast open space of the ranch yard. Silas buried the axe head in a stump. He wiped his brow with his sleeve. Annex is round the back, he said. He pointed with a gloved hand. Doors open. Wood's in the bin. Pantry's in the main kitchen. You find what you need. Thank you. Mr. Vance, Clara said. Her spine was straight. It's Silas. He picked up an armful of split wood. I'll be out on the fence line till noon. You can start with the kitchen. He walked away. He didn't hover. He didn't give her a tour or lay down a list of rules. It was deliberate. Silas knew the look of a trapped animal. He knew Clara felt backed into a corner by her own hunger. If he treated her like a guest, she'd feel like a beggar. If he treated her like a servant, she'd feel owned. So he treated her like a hand. He gave her the work, and he gave her the space to do it. The morning passed in a quiet, productive blur. Clara found the annex. It was small, but it was dry. The stove was cast iron and drew well. The beds had old, clean quilts. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have to worry about the wind. She left the kids settling into the annex and went to the main house. The house was large, built of thick timber and fieldstone. It was a house built for a family, but the silence inside was heavy. It was the silence of a place that had stopped living a few years back. The floors were swept, the counters were clear, but there was a layer of dust on the things that didn't matter to a man living alone. The curtains, the top shelves, the pictures on the mantel. Clara rolled up her sleeves. She found a bucket. She pumped water from the kitchen sink. She worked with a fierce, burning energy. She wasn't just scrubbing floors. She was scrubbing away the shame of the cellar. She was paying her way. With every stroke of the brush, she reclaimed a piece of herself. Around mid-morning, Caleb wandered out to the front porch. He was a quiet boy, the kind of quiet that comes from watching adults worry too much. He wanted to help. He felt the weight of what Silas had done for them the night before. He looked around the porch. By the front door sat a pair of Silas S-Town boots. They were good leather, but caked with dried mud and neglect. Caleb knew how to shine boots. His father used to make him do it on Sundays before church. He went to the annex. He found a rag in his mother's bag. He found a tin of saddle soap on a shelf in the tack room. He sat down on the porch steps, put the heavy boot between his knees, and started rubbing the soap into the leather. He worked hard. He wanted the boots to shine like glass. He wanted the big man to look down and smile, to know that they were grateful, that they were good for something. Clara came out the front door to shake a rug. She stopped. She looked at her son sitting in the dirt, feverishly polishing another man's boots. A shadow crossed her face. She dropped the rug over the rail. She walked down the steps. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was sharp, not angry, but urgent. The boy looked up. He smiled, holding up the half-shine boot. "Look, Mama, I'm helping Mr. Silas." Clara knelt down in the dirt next to him. She gently took the boot from his hands. She set it back on the porch. She took the rag and the soap tin from his fingers. "Stand up, Caleb," she said softly. The boy stood. He looked confused. Clara put her hands on his shoulders. She looked him dead in the eye. "Listen to me," Clara said. Her voice was low, but it carried. "We are poor right now. We are hungry. But we are not less." Caleb blinked. "But he fed us. I just wanted to pay him back." "We pay him back with the work we agreed to," Clara said. "I cook. I clean the house. You gather the eggs. You bring in the wood. We trade our sweat for his food. That is an honest trade between equals." She squeezed his shoulders. "You don't grovel, Caleb. You don't take another man's boots unasked, just to earn a smile. We work to earn our bread, Caleb. Poverty doesn't strip away our humanity. Mr. Silas respects us by offering honest work, so you keep your head held high like a free worker, not a beggar. You owe no man your pride. Do you understand me?" Caleb looked at the serious, fierce look in his mother's eyes. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Mama. Good. Now go check the wood box. See if it needs filling." Caleb ran off toward the side of the house. Clara stood up. She brushed the dirt from her skirt. She turned back toward the door. Silas was standing at the corner of the porch. He had come up from the barn, his tools over his shoulder. He had heard the whole thing. Clara froze. A flash of fear hit her. She had just told her son not to act like a servant on a man's land when they were living on his charity. Men with property didn't take kindly to pride from people with nothing. Silas didn't say a word. He looked at the half-shined boot on the porch. He looked at Clara. His face was unreadable, the hard jaw, the deep-set eyes beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. He stepped up onto the porch. He walked past her, boots thudding heavy on the wood. He reached down, picked up the tin of saddle soap in the rag, and set them on the railing. "Lunch at noon?" he asked, not looking back. "Yes," Clara said, finding her voice. "Beans and cornbread." "Good," Silas said. He opened the door. "I'll wash up at the pump." He went inside. Clara let out a breath. She didn't know she was holding. She had drawn a line in the sand, and the man hadn't stepped over it. He had walked right alongside it. At noon, Silas came to the kitchen. The table was set. The smell of hot food filled the room. It was the first time in years the kitchen smelled like a home instead of just a place to eat and leave. Clara had set 3 plates at the small table in the corner and 1 plate at the head of the large dining table. Silas looked at the setup. The division, the master at the big table, the help in the corner. That was the way the world worked. That was the custom. Silas walked over to the stove. Clara stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. Silas took a heavy iron ladle. He took his own plate from the big table. He scooped a generous ladle of beans onto it. a square of cornbread. Then he picked up Caleb's plate. He scooped the exact same amount. Same beans, same cornbread. He did the same for Abigail. He did the same for Clara. No extra portion for the master. No scraps for the hands. Exact, level measures. He carried his plate to the small table in the corner. He pulled out a wooden chair. It scraped loud against the floorboards. He sat down. He looked at Clara, who was staring at him in shock. He looked at Caleb, who was standing frozen by the door. "Food's getting cold," Silas said. He picked up his fork. Slowly, carefully, Clara brought the kids to the table. She sat down opposite Silas. Caleb sat on her left, Abigail on her right. The table was small. Their elbows nearly touched. They ate in silence. The clinking of forks on tin plates, the sound of the wind outside. It wasn't a comfortable silence. Not yet. There was still too much unknown between them. But it wasn't the heavy, fearful silence of the cellar either. Silas didn't make a speech. He didn't announce that they were equals. He didn't say a word about what he had heard on the porch. He just sat at their table. He ate the same food in the same amount. He broke the invisible wall that society had built between a landowner and a destitute widow. He proved Clara's words right. They were not less. When Silas finished, he wiped his mouth with a napkin. He stood up, picked up his empty plate, and set it gently in the wash basin. He put his hat back on. "Cornbread's good," he said to the room. He walked out the back door, heading back to the fence line. Clara sat at the table for a long time after he left. She looked at the empty chair across from her. She listened to the rhythm of Silas's hammer, echoing from the distant pasture. She looked at Caleb. The boy was eating his beans, his shoulders relaxed, his head held up. For the first time since her husband died, Clara felt the tight, heavy knot of terror in her chest loosen. She didn't know how long this would last. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for today, they had a roof. They had food. And most importantly, they had their dignity intact. They were surviving, and they were doing it on their feet, not on their knees. Clara picked up her fork. She took a bite of the cornbread. It tasted like hope. Towns in the hill country weren't much more than a collection of wooden boxes dropped in the dust. Kendall was no different. It had a bank, a saloon, a telegraph office, and Abernathy's general store. It also had a memory and a mouth. It had been 3 weeks since Clara and the kids moved into the annex. 3 weeks of quiet, steady work. Silas cut the timber. He patched the fences. Clara scrubbed the floors and kept the stove hot. Caleb brought in the eggs. Little Abigail fed the barn cats. They were finding a rhythm, a cadence of survival. But towns don't like quiet. They prefer a story. And Phineas Hayes was more than happy to give them one. Phineas was Clara's cousin by blood, but not by nature. He was a man who wore expensive suits, bought on borrowed credit. He had spent the last month in Kendall, drinking whiskey he couldn't afford, waiting for the county judge to rule on Elias Hayes' estate. When Phineas heard Clara had taken shelter at the Vance place, he didn't check to see if his niece and nephew were starving. He went straight to the saloon. He planted his elbows on the mahogany bar. He talked loud enough for the tables to hear. He spun a tale about a desperate widow, a lonely, grieving rancher. A convenient arrangement that didn't involve wedding vows or decency. He made it sound cheap. He made it sound dirty. Words are like spilled water in a dry town. They spread fast, and they leave a stain. Saturday morning, supply day. Silas hitched the roan to the buckboard. He told Clara to come along. Winter was setting in hard. The kids needed heavy coats, and the larder needed flour and salt. The ride-in was cold but bright. Clara sat beside him on the wooden bench. She wore her faded brown dress, clean and mended. her chin tucked into a thin wool shawl. They rolled into Kendall right around 10. Silas tied the horse to the hitching post outside Abernathy S. "I need to stop by the blacksmith," he said. "Get a new iron tire for the rear wheel. You go on in, order what we need. I'll be back to settle the tab." Clara nodded. She stepped up onto the boardwalk. She held a slip of paper with a carefully calculated list. She pushed open the heavy glass door. A small bell chimed. The store smelled of coffee beans, oiled leather, and peppermint. Mr. Abernathy was behind the counter. He was a thick-necked man with a neat apron and eyes that moved too fast. There were 3 other women in the store, looking over bolts of calico cloth. When Clara walked in, the talking stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was a sudden, heavy silence. The women looked at Clara, then they looked at each other. They gathered their skirts and moved down the aisle, putting a solid row of shelving between them and her. Clara felt the heat rise in her neck. She knew that silence. She had been a schoolteacher. She knew how towns operated. She kept her back straight. She walked up to the counter. She placed her list on the polished wood. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," Clara said. Her voice was steady. "I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt, 2 tins of baking powder, and I'd like to look at the winter coats you have for children." Abernathy didn't reach for the list. He kept his hands resting on his apron. He looked Clara up and down. His gaze was slow. It wasn't friendly. It was an appraisal, and it lacked respect. "That's a sizable order, Mrs. Hayes," Abernathy said. He leaned in a little. "Usually, folks need a line of credit for that much bulk." "Mr. Vance will be in shortly to settle the account," Clara said. "In cash." Abernathy let out a short, dry breath through his nose. He picked up a rag and started wiping the counter, moving the rag right over her list. "Well now," Abernathy said, his voice loud enough for the women in the next aisle to hear, "I do business with Silas Vance. Have for years. But I don't know that I make a habit of extending his good name to whoever happens to be keeping his bed warm for the winter." The words hit the air like a cracked whip. Clara froze. The breath was knocked clean out of her. The humiliation was sudden and suffocating. Her hands began to tremble. She reached out and snatched her list back from the counter. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just turned around to leave. She almost ran right into Silas' chest. Silas had walked in right as Abernathy started talking. He stood in the doorway. He blocked the light. He looked bigger inside the store than he did out on the open range. He didn't look at Clara. He looked right over her head, straight at Abernathy. The store went dead quiet, the kind of quiet that happens right before lightning strikes. Silas stepped forward. His boots hit the floorboards with a heavy, deliberate sound. He stopped at the counter. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy silver dollar. He placed it on the glass counter. He didn't slam it. He set it down softly. The soft clink echoed in the silent room. "Flour," Silas said. His voice was dangerously low. "Salt, baking powder, and 2 wool coats for the kids." Abernathy swallowed. The sneer had vanished from his face. "Silas, I was just explaining to the lady." "You weren't explaining a damn thing." Silas cut him off. He leaned over the counter. His face was inches from Abernathy S. "You listen to me, Abernathy," Silas said. Every word was clipped, precise. "A single woman working with her own 2 hands has the right to live and be respected, just as much as any man in this town. Her dignity ain't determined by the wagging tongues of fools, and it sure as hell ain't determined by a man who hides behind a cash register." Silas tapped the silver dollar with his rough index finger. "She is my housekeeper. She earns her keep through hard work. She has more honor in her little finger than half the men who drink in that saloon across the street. You will address her as ma'am. You will fill her order. And if I ever hear a word out of your mouth that suggests otherwise, I won't be paying with silver next time." Abernathy was pale. He nodded quickly. "Yes, Silas. Right away. No offense meant." "Fill the order," Silas said. He turned away. He looked at Clara. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide. "Go pick out the coats," Silas said, his voice dropping back to a normal, steady rhythm. "Get the heavy ones. Winter's going to be bad." He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't make a scene of comforting her. He just gave her the space to do what she came to do, to finish her task, to be a mother. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The back of the wagon was loaded with supplies. The two new woolen coats sat on Clara's lap. She ran her fingers over the thick fabric. The wind howled across the plains, but inside the wagon there was peace. Clara looked sideways at Silas. His jaw was set. His hands rested easy on the reins. He wasn't puffing his chest. He wasn't acting like a hero waiting for a prize. He had defended her humanity, and then he had gone right back to the business of driving the team. He had protected her without making her feel small. He had given her back the power the town tried to strip away. "Thank you," Clara said softly. Silas didn't look over. He just clicked his tongue at the roan. "Don't thank me for that," Silas said. "A man shouldn't be thanked for doing what's right. He should just do it." Clara smiled. A small, real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes. The kind that heals. A week later, the first real freeze hit. The wind shifted north, bringing a bitter, biting cold that turned the mud to stone. Silas spent the morning chopping extra firewood. Around noon, he noticed the tin chimney pipe on the annex roof was listing to the side. The wind had knocked it loose. If he didn't fix it, the smoke would back up into Clara's stove, or worse, catch the dry roof timbers on fire. Clara had taken the kids down to the creek to check the rabbit snares. The annex was empty. Silas grabbed his hammer, a handful of nails, and went inside. The annex was a single room, but Clara had made it feel like a home. The beds were made tight. The floor was swept. The smell of dried lavender hung in the air, masking the old, musty scent of the ranch hands who used to sleep there. Silas climbed onto a sturdy wooden chair to reach the ceiling joint where the pipe fed through. The space above the rafters was cramped. He reached up, shifting his weight. His shoulder brushed against something sitting on the high crossbeam, a small wooden box. Clara had put it up high, out of the way, safe from mice and curious children. Silas tried to catch it, but his heavy gloves fumbled. The box tipped. It fell. It hit the floorboards with a sharp crack. The brass latch popped open. Papers spilled out across the floor. Silas cursed softly. He climbed down from the chair. He stripped off his leather gloves and knelt down to gather the spilled items. He didn't mean to pry. A man's private papers were his own business. He reached for a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. As he picked them up, the top letter slid sideways. The handwriting caught his eye. It was jagged, uneven. The handwriting of a man who worked with his hands, not a pen. Silas recognized it instantly. He had stared at that signature for 3 hours on a lawyer's desk. 8 Elias Hayes. Silas froze. He stared at the name. Hayes. Clara Hayes. He let out a slow, sharp breath. The pieces clicked together like the cylinder of his Colt. Elias Hayes was the man Silas had bought this ranch from. The man who had sold him the 200 acres, the creek, the old trapper's cabin. Elias Hayes was a broken, desperate man who had taken a low price for good land and moved away. Clara wasn't just a drifter who had stumbled onto his property. She was the daughter of the man who used to own the dirt. Silas stood on. Silas sat back on his heels. His mind raced. Did she know? Of course she knew. That why she was in the old cellar. That why she hadn't moved on to the next town. She was tied to this place. He reached out to pick up a larger, thicker piece of paper that had fluttered under the bed. It was stiff, formal. It had a bank seal stamped in blue ink in the corner. Silas pulled it out. It was a bank draft, a cashier's squash check. He looked at the amount. $180. $180. That was a fortune to a starving family. It was enough to buy a wagon, a team of horses, and enough food to last 2 winters. It was enough to rent a house in San Antonio. It was enough to keep a mother from stealing feed corn in a freezing cellar. Why hadn't she cashed it? Why choose starvation when she had a fortune in a wooden box? Silas' eyes moved down the stiff paper. He read the pay to the order of line. It didn't have Clara's name on it. It read, "Pay to the order of the Kendall County Court." And in the memo line at the bottom, written in a sharp legal scrawl, "Filing fees and retainer, estate dispute versus Phineas Hayes." Silas stared at the paper. The silence in the room felt heavy, thick. She had money, but it was frozen. It was bound by the rigid, unyielding gears of the law. To cash it meant she had to cancel the draft. It meant taking the money back from the lawyer. It meant dropping her lawsuit against her cousin, Phineas. It meant giving up her fight for her father's legacy, for whatever was rightfully hers. Silas looked at the draft. Then he looked toward the door, where the freezing wind was rattling the frame. He remembered the look in her eyes that night, in the cellar, the wild, desperate terror. She had watched her children shiver. She had faced the very real possibility of starving to death in the dirt, and she had chosen that. She had chosen to suffer. She had chosen the humiliation of stealing animal feed. She had chosen to bear the weight of Abernathy insults. She took all of it just so she wouldn't have to surrender her fight for justice. She wouldn't let a thief take what belonged to her family, even if it cost her her pride, even if it cost her her comfort. Silas felt a strange, tight feeling in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was for the weak. It was awe. He had thought he was a tough man because he worked hard and paid his debts. But sitting on the floor of the annex, holding a piece of paper that represented a Mother S. iron will, Silas realized he didn't know the half of what toughness was. He was looking at the ghost of a warrior, a woman fighting a war without a gun. Silas carefully folded the bank draft. He placed it back in the wooden box. He stacked the letters exactly as they had fallen. He closed the lid, snapped the brass latch shut, and stood up on the chair. He placed the box exactly where it had been, high on the crossbeam. He didn't fix the chimney pipe. He packed his tools and walked out of the annex. He needed to be outside. He needed the cold air. He walked down toward the creek. He saw them in the distance. Clara was showing Caleb how to set a snare in the brush. Her breath plumed in the cold air. She looked fragile in the winter light, but Silas knew better now. There was nothing fragile about her. He wouldn't ask her about the box. He wouldn't confront her about her father. That was her battle. She had earned the right to fight it her way. But as he watched her, Silas made a quiet vow to himself. He didn't know how the law would shake out. He didn't know if he would lose the ranch in a month to Amos Thorne and the bank. But as long as he had breath in his lungs, he was going to make sure Clara Hayes never had to choose between fighting for her justice and feeding her kids again. The postwriter didn't come up the drive often. When he did, he didn't stay for coffee. He handed over the mail, tipped his hat, and rode on. It was a Tuesday. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Silas stood by the gate, holding a single envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. The handwriting on the front was neat, looped, and perfectly slanted. It was the handwriting of a man who worked at a desk, not a man who worked the earth. It was from his son, Matthew, postmarked Boston. Silas didn't open it right away. He slid it into the breast pocket of his coat. He went back to the barn. He spent the next 6 hours mending harnesses. He worked until his fingers were numb and his shoulders burned. He worked to keep his mind quiet. The deadline was coming. December 15th, 3 weeks away. Amos, Thorne, and the bank were waiting. The $800 debt felt like a physical weight pressing down on the back of his neck. Silas had run the numbers 100 times. He had counted every head of cattle, every bushel of grain, every piece of rusted equipment. It wasn't enough. He was going to lose the eastern 60, the creek, the best grazing land, and once that was gone, the rest of the ranch would slowly bleed out. He was fighting a losing war. But a man fought anyway. You fought for the land because you wanted to leave something behind. You wanted your name to mean something when you were gone. The sun dropped behind the hills. The cold settled in hard. Silas walked back to the main house. Clara was in the kitchen finishing the dinner dishes. The smell of stew and lye soap filled the room. Caleb and Abigail were already asleep in the annex. Evening, Silas said. He hung his hat on the peg. I left a plate on the stove to keep warm, Clara said. She didn't turn around. She kept scrubbing the cast iron pot. Thank you. I'll eat shortly. Silas didn't go to the stove. He walked into the parlor. He didn't light the lamp. The only light came from the dying embers in the stone fireplace. He sat down in his heavy leather chair. He reached into his coat. He pulled out the envelope. He opened it in the dark. He leaned forward, catching the dull orange glow of the embers to read the words. It was short, 3 paragraphs. Matthew was doing well. The mercantile firm had promoted him. He was courting a girl from a good family. The city was loud, but he liked the pace. Then came the last paragraph. I know the winter is hard out there, Father, but I won't be coming back. Not for the spring thaw, and not after. The ranch was your dream, not mine. I don't want to fight the dirt anymore. I don't want to die tired like Mother did. Sell the land if you have to. Let it go. Silas stopped reading. Let it go. He stared at the paper. The words blurred. He had spent 20 years breaking his back on this land. He had buried his wife on the hill behind the orchard. He had co-signed a note for a friend, because out here, a man's word was his bond, and he had believed the man would pay it back. He had taken every hit the world threw at him. He had stayed standing. For what? For a son who didn't want it. For a legacy that ended right here in a dark room with an unpaid banknote. The paper slipped from Silas' fingers. It hit the floor. Silas leaned forward. He rested his elbows on his knees. He buried his face in his large, calloused hands. He didn't make a sound. He didn't cry out. He just stopped holding it all up. The stoic, unbending rancher cracked. The exhaustion, the grief, the crushing failure, it all rushed in at once. He was 44 years old, and he was completely, utterly empty. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Silas didn't look up. He couldn't. He didn't have the strength to put the mask back on. Clara stood in the doorway. She held a drying towel in her hands. She looked at the dark room. She looked at the man slumped in the chair. She saw the white envelope pale against the dark floorboards. She knew what a broken man looked like. She had watched her own father wither away under the weight of debt and shame. She knew the pride of men. She knew that if she spoke the wrong word, if she offered pity, Silas would harden. He would push her away to protect his pride. So Clara didn't speak. She turned around. She went back to the kitchen. Silas heard her leave. A bitter taste filled his mouth. He was glad she was gone. He didn't want witnesses. A minute later, she came back. She walked into the parlor. She carried 2 tin cups. Steam rose from the dark coffee. She didn't turn on the lamp. She didn't try to flood the room with light. She let the darkness remain. She walked over to the small wooden table next to Silas' chair. She set 1 cup down near his elbow. Then she pulled up a straight-backed wooden chair. She set it facing the fireplace, right next to him. She sat down. She took a sip of her coffee. She didn't look at him. She looked at the embers. Silas slowly lifted his head from his hands. He looked at the woman sitting beside him in the dark. She didn't ask what the letter said. She didn't tell him that things would get better. She didn't offer empty prayers or hollow comfort. She just sat there. She anchored him. She gave him the one thing a strong man rarely gets. She gave him permission to be weak. She offered a shared silence, proving that he didn't have to carry the silence alone. It was a profound kind of equality. She wasn't his housekeeper right now, and he wasn't the master of the ranch. They were just 2 people who had been beaten down by the world, sitting by a dying fire. Silas reached out. His hand trembled just a fraction. He took the hot tin cup. He took a slow drink. The coffee was strong, bitter and hot. "He's not coming back," Silas said. His voice was a hoarse whisper. It was the first time he had spoken the truth aloud. Clara kept her eyes on the fire. "Then he's a fool," she said softly, "because this is a good place, and you are a good man." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Silas closed his eyes. The knot in his chest didn't vanish. The debt was still there. The land was still dying. But the crushing, suffocating loneliness of it broke. He leaned back in his chair. He drank his coffee, and for the first time in 3 years, Silas Vance didn't feel entirely alone. Reverend Josiah Miller rode a mule. He claimed horses were too proud for a man of the cloth. He arrived at the Vance Ranch 2 days later. It was mid-morning. The frost had melted into a thick, cold mud. Silas met him in the yard. The Reverend was a tall, thin man with a face like carved hickory. He carried a leather satchel across his chest. "Morning, Josiah," Silas said. He wiped mud from his gloves. "Coffee's on the stove. You look half frozen." "I wish this was a social call, Silas," the Reverend said. He didn't dismount. He reached into his satchel. He pulled out a folded legal document. It had the heavy red wax seal of the Kendall County Court. "I come bearing court business. The judge asked me to deliver notices out this way." Silas frowned. He took the document. "The bank ain't due for another 2 weeks. Thorne said he'd give me till the 15th. "It's not the bank," Josiah said quietly. "It's about the land." Silas opened the paper. The legal print was small and dense, but the names jumped out at him in bold ink. Clara Hayes, v. Phineas Hayes. Notice of pending litigation regarding the estate of Elias Hayes. Silas read further. His eyes narrowed. The document was a formal notice to all current property holders that the original deed signed by Elias Hayes might be contested. Phineas Hayes was claiming the estate. Clara Hayes was claiming the estate. And if the court found that Elias Hayes had been coerced or not of sound mind when he sold the land, all subsequent sales could be frozen. Silas read the words again. His heart turned to lead in his chest. If Clara won and proved the sale was bad, the deed in Silas' lockbox wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. He wouldn't just lose the Eastern 60 to the bank, he would lose everything. And Clara was the one bringing the suit. Silas looked up. Reverend Miller was watching him with a sympathetic, heavy gaze. "She's living here, Silas," Josiah said softly. "I know she is. The town knows it. I don't know what kind of arrangement you 2 have, but you need to watch your back. That woman has a grievance, and she's aiming it right at the ground you stand on." Silas folded the paper. He tucked it into his coat. His face was stone. "Appreciate the delivery, Reverend," Silas said. His voice was flat. Josiah nodded, turned his mule, and rode away. Silas stood in the mud for a long time. The pieces fell together. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. The bank draft for court fees in her box. Her refusal to leave the old cellar. Her willingness to work as a housekeeper. She wasn't just surviving. She had infiltrated. She was on his land, inside his house, building a case to take it all back. He felt a hot flash of betrayal. He had dropped his bag for her. He had defended her in town. He had sat in the dark with her and bared his soul, and she was a spy. Silas turned and walked to the house. He didn't stomp. He didn't rush. His steps were measured and lethal. He walked into the kitchen. Clara was kneading dough at the table. Her hands were covered in flour. She looked up and smiled. The smile died the moment she saw his eyes. Silas reached into his coat. He pulled out the court notice. He tossed it onto the floured table. It landed with a soft smack. "Reverend Miller just rode through," Silas said. His voice was dangerously calm. "Brought me a warning." Clara looked at the paper with the red seal. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired. "You didn't tell me," Silas said. "No, I didn't. You came here for the ranch." It wasn't a question. Clara stood up straight. She met his gaze. "I came here for my father. The ranch is just the dirt he died over." Silas felt his jaw tighten. "You're suing your cousin. You're trying to prove your father was cheated. If you prove that, the deed I bought is void. You know that, don't you?" "Yes. So you sat at my table. You ate my food. You let me defend your honor in town, all while you were waiting to pull the rug out from under me." "That's not true," Clara's voice flared. The sudden anger in her shocked him. She stepped around the table. She walked right up to him. She didn't back down from his size or his anger. "I didn't come here to steal from you, Silas. I didn't come here to ruin you. I came here because somewhere in this house there is a piece of paper, a handwritten will. My father wrote it before he died. He hid it. It proves the land was supposed to go to me, not to Phineas. And if you find it," Silas challenged, "what then? You take it to the judge and tell him my deed is a fraud?" "Your deed is a fraud," Clara shouted. Tears sprang to her eyes, born of pure frustration. "Not because you're a bad man, Silas, but because the system is rigged for men like you." Silas blinked. "I paid him a fair price, $600. My father couldn't read." Clara's voice broke. She pointed a trembling finger at the court document. "He couldn't read a single word on that paper you handed him. He was in debt. He was terrified. And the lawyers in town, the men with education, they told him 600 was all it was worth. They told him if he didn't sign, the county would take it for taxes. They lied. To him." She took a ragged breath. "He signed an X on a piece of paper he didn't understand, because the law always sides with men who have education and money. The law protects the strong. It crushes the people who don't know how to fight back." Silas stood frozen. "I don't hate you, Silas," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But you benefited from a system that chewed my father up and spit him out. You got this land because a good, honest man was too uneducated to defend himself. All my life, all I wanted is to prove that the weak have a right to what belongs to them. I have to find that will, to stop Phineas, to speak for my father." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded like hammer strikes. Silas looked at Clara. He looked at the tears tracking through the flour on her cheek. He didn't see a spy anymore. He saw exactly what he had seen in the cellar. A warrior, a woman fighting a desperate battle against a world that was entirely stacked against her. And she was right. Silas had bought the land fair and square according to the law. But the law wasn't justice. He hadn't asked if Elias Hayes could read. He hadn't asked why the man looked so defeated when he signed the paper. He had just taken his deed and walked away. Ignorance didn't make him innocent. Silas looked down at his boots. He felt a deep, sickening shame. He had prided himself on being a righteous man. But his righteousness was built on someone else's ruin. He looked back up at Clara. "You're looking for a handwritten will," Silas said. His voice was completely stripped of anger. Clara nodded slowly, wary of the shift in his tone. "Yes, I believe he hid it under the floorboards in the old section of the house. I've been checking when you were in the fields." Silas looked at the floor. He looked at the walls. "The judge convenes on the 10th of December, Silas said. "Yes." Silas reached out. He picked up the court document from the flowered table. He folded it neatly and placed it back in his coat pocket. He looked at Clara. The hard rancher was gone. Only the man remained. "Then we'd best start tearing up the floorboards," Silas said, "before it gets dark." Clara stared at him, stunned. "If we find it, you could lose everything." "I know," Silas said. He turned and walked toward the hallway. "Get a crowbar, Clara. We've got work to do." The sun didn't bring any warmth the next morning. It just lit up the frost. Silas was up before the stove was hot. He didn't go to the barn. He went to the tool shed. He grabbed a heavy iron crowbar, a claw hammer, and a pair of thick leather knee pads. He walked into the main house. Clara was already at the stove, boiling water. She looked at the iron bar in his hand. She didn't say a word. She just stepped back. "The old section," Silas said. He pointed toward the back hallway. "The wood there is pine, put down before the oak in the parlor. If your father hid something, he'd hide it where the boards are soft enough to pry without splitting." Clara wiped her hands. She followed him. They started in the back bedroom. Silas dropped to his knees. He wedged the flat edge of the crowbar into the seam between two floorboards. He leaned his weight into the iron. The old iron nail squealed. It sounded like a wounded animal. The board popped loose. Dust from 20 years ago rose into the cold air. Silas reached his gloved hand into the dark gap. Nothing but dry dirt and cobwebs. "Next one," Silas said. They worked for hours. The house filled with the sound of tearing wood. It was a violent sound, a man tearing his own house apart. He was dismantling the very thing that kept him warm. Clara knelt beside him. She used the claw hammer to pull the stubborn nails. Her knuckles bled. She didn't stop to bandage them. She wiped the blood on her apron and kept pulling. Implicit value. Silas didn't let her work alone. He was a man with a heavy debt, a man on the verge of ruin. But he was using his own sweat to dig up the paper that would finish him. He had stopped protecting his property. He was protecting her truth. By noon, the back hallway looked like a timber yard. They moved to the kitchen pantry. The floorboards here were warped from years of spilled water and heavy boots. Silas wedged the bar in. He pushed. The board groaned, then snapped. He reached into the dark. His fingers brushed against dirt. Then they brushed against something else. Something wrapped in heavy, oiled canvas. Silas stopped. He stopped breathing for a second. He curled his fingers around it. He pulled it up into the light. It was a small, flat package, tied with a leather shoelace. The oilcloth was stiff with age, caked in gray dust. Clara dropped her hammer. It hit the floor with a loud clang. She stared at the package in Silas's hands. She couldn't move. Her chest heaved. Silas didn't hand it to her right away. He untied the leather lace. He peeled back the stiff canvas. Inside was a single piece of heavy parchment. Silas unfolded it. The ink was faded to a dull brown, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same jagged, uneducated script from the letters in Clara's box, but below that script were two other signatures, clean, sharp signatures, witnesses. One of them was Reverend Josiah Miller. Silas read the words. It took him less than a minute. It was a will, plain and simple. Written 3 days before Elias Hayes sold the ranch to Silas, it explicitly left the entirety of the property, including the creek and the eastern 60, to his only daughter, Clara Hayes. It stated that any sale made under duress of his mounting debts was against his final, dying wish. It was a legal anchor, a heavy iron anchor, and it was tied straight to Silas Vance's neck. Silas looked at the paper. He held his own ruin in his 2 hands. There was a fire burning in the kitchen stove 10 feet away. He could take 3 steps. He could drop the paper into the flames. In 10 seconds, it would be ash. The ranch would be his. He could fight the bank, fight Amos Thorne, keep his land. The law would never know. Clara watched him. She saw him look at the stove. She stopped breathing. She knew exactly what he held, and she knew exactly what he could do with it. She was a woman alone. She had no power to stop him. Silas looked at the stove. Then he looked at Clara. He saw her bleeding knuckles. He saw the faded, worn dress she had worn for a month. He saw the terror returning to her eyes, the same terror from the root cellar. Silas folded the parchment. He stood up. He walked over to her. He reached out and placed it directly into her dirty, calloused hands. He closed her fingers over it. "Get your coat," Silas said. His voice was rough, dry from the dust. "We need to get to town. The judge needs to see this before Phineas catches wind of it." Clara stared at her hands. The paper felt heavier than iron. She looked up at him. The tears she had fought back for 3 weeks finally broke. They spilled over her eyelashes, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Why?" Clara whispered. Her voice shook. "Silas, this means you lose. This means my father's sale to you was illegal. The judge will void your deed. Why are you handing this to me?" Silas looked down at her. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried for too long. Explicit, value, spoken. "Because I was wrong," Silas said. He spoke slow, making sure every word landed. "I thought playing by the rules made me an honest man, but the rules are just words written by men with money, Clara. They don't mean a damn thing if they reuse to crush the people who can't fight back." He reached out. With a rough, calloused thumb, he wiped a tear from her cheek. "Courts hand out law, Clara," Silas said quietly, "but only people can hand out justice. Fairness ain't something we wait for a judge to decide. It's what we choose to give back to each other. Your father was cheated by the system, and I won't be a part of that system anymore. That land is your father's. Now it's yours. Go claim it." Clara clutched the paper to her chest. She didn't say thank you. Thank you wasn't big enough for what had just happened. She just nodded. They walked out of the torn-up house together. The Kendall County courthouse smelled like wet wool, old floor wax, and chewing tobacco. It was December 10th. The sky outside was a heavy, threatening gray. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Townsfolk liked a spectacle. They liked to see who would break. Silas sat in the back row. He kept his hat in his hands. He wore his good suit, but the collar was frayed. He looked out of place among the suits and ties. He looked like what he was, a man of the dirt, waiting for the men of the law to take it all away. Up front, Clara sat at a heavy oak table. She wore a borrowed dark blue dress. Her back was arrow straight. She didn't look back at Silas. She kept her eyes on the judge. Phineas Hayes sat at the opposite table. He wore a pinstripe suit. He looked smug. He was leaning back in his chair, whispering to his lawyer. He figured he had it won. He was a man. He was the next of kin. That was usually enough. Judge Harmon hit his gavel. The sound cracked like a pistol shot in the stuffy room. The proceedings were fast. Phineas's lawyer stood up. He talked about bloodlines. He talked about the natural order of property. He talked about Clara being a fragile widow who couldn't possibly manage an estate, even if there was one left to manage. Clara didn't flinch. When it was her turn, she didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have the money for one. She stood up herself. She walked to the bench. She handed the heavy parchment up to the clerk. The clerk handed it to Judge Harmon. "I have a will, Your Honor," Clara said. Her voice rang clear across the courtroom. "Written by my father, Elias Hayes. Witnessed by Reverend Josiah Miller, who sits in the second row today." Phineas sat up fast. His smug smile vanished. "Objection! That's a forgery." Judge Harmon ignored him. He put on his reading glasses. He read the paper. Then he looked over at Reverend Miller. The Reverend stood up and gave a single, solemn nod. The judge took off his glasses. He looked down at Phineas. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his voice dripping with boredom, "you have no claim here. This document is sound. Your petition is dismissed." A murmur ran through the crowd. Phineas slammed his fist on the table, his face red, but his lawyer pulled him back down. Judge Harmon turned his gaze to Clara. "Mrs. Hayes," the judge said. The boredom was gone. "Now." He looked serious. He looked over the tops of his spectacles, straight to the back row, right at Silas. "This will name you as the sole heir to the 200 acres, known as the Hayes Tract," the judge said slowly. "However, court records show your late father sold that exact tract to one Silas Vance in the spring of 1870. The courtroom went dead quiet. Everyone knew Silas. Everyone knew he was sitting right there. "Because this will predates that sale," Judge Harmon continued, "and because explicitly states your father was under duress, you have grounds. The law allows you to file an immediate petition to void the deed currently held by Mr. Vance. You can reclaim the land, all of it, today." The judge leaned forward. "Do you wish to file that petition against Mr. Vance?" Silas sat perfectly still. He didn't look away. He looked at Clara's back. He was ready. He had made his peace with it. He would pack his bags tonight. He would leave the horses for her. Clara stood silent for a long moment. She looked at the judge. Then, slowly, she turned around. She looked past the lawyers. She looked past her furious cousin. She looked past the gossiping townsfolk. She looked straight to the back row, straight at Silas. Her eyes were calm. The wild, trapped look of the seller was gone forever. Clara turned back to the judge. "Twist 5. "No, Your Honor," Clara said. The crowd gasped. Phineas looked like he had been struck by lightning. Judge Harmon frowned. "Mrs. Hayes, are you certain? You are forfeiting a substantial estate. You have the legal right to take back that ranch." "I have the legal right," Clara said, her voice steady and loud enough for every soul in the room to hear. "But I have no moral right. I withdraw all claims against the property currently held by Silas Vance. Let the record show his deed is clear." The judge stared at her. Then he shrugged. "As you wish. Case closed." He slammed the gavel. The ride home was freezing. The sky had finally broken, spitting hard, icy sleet. Silas drove the buckboard. Clara sat beside him, wrapped in her heavy wool coat. They were a mile out of town before Silas finally spoke. "You had it," Silas said. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road. "You had the gavel in your hand. You could have taken it all. The house, the cattle, the Eastern 60. It was yours." "I know," Clara said. "Then why didn't you?" Silas pulled back on the reins. The wagon came to a halt in the middle of the empty, sleet-covered road. He turned to look at her. He needed to know. He had been ready to lose everything because it was the right thing to do. He didn't understand why she had thrown it away. Was it pity? Silas asked. His voice was hard. Because I don't want your pity, Clara. I told you, you deserved that land. Clara didn't back away from his hard stare. Explicit, value-spoken. I came here for the dirt, Silas, Clara said softly. The wind whipped her hair across her face. I came here for a piece of paper to prove my father wasn't a fool. She reached out. She placed her gloved hand over his bare, cold hand on the reins. But I stayed, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, because of that night in the cellar. Silas froze. When you opened those doors, Clara said, I was nothing. I was a filthy, desperate thief. I had lost all my pride. I had lost everything that made me human. I was waiting for you to shoot me, or cage me, or treat me like a stray dog. She squeezed his hand. But you didn't look at me like the scum of the earth. You didn't wave the law in my face. You dropped your bag. You cooked my children a hot meal. You looked at me like a human being who needed to live. A single tear mixed with the freezing sleet on her cheek. I could never take land from the man who gave me my dignity back. Law is just a piece of paper, Silas. You showed me what real justice looks like. I don't want the land without the man who works it. Silas looked at her. The wind howled around them, biting and vicious, but he didn't feel cold at all. He looked at the hand resting on his. Then he looked into her eyes. The space between them, the distance that had always been there, the owner and the housekeeper, the indebted and the aggrieved. It was gone. There was no debt anymore. There was no law between them. There were just two people, sitting in a wagon who had chosen each other over everything else. Silas turned his hand over. He laced his rough fingers through hers. I held on tight. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He clicked his tongue, snapped the reins with his free hand, and drove them home. December 15th came cold. There was ice on the water barrel, frost on the window panes. The sky was a pale, empty blue. It was the kind of morning that didn't offer any favors. Silas Vance sat at the heavy oak dining table. He had his ledger open. The ink was dry. The numbers hadn't changed in the night. He was still short. He closed the book. He didn't slam it. He just closed it. Amos Thorne would be driving up that road by noon. Amos would tip his hat. He would look sorry. And then he would take the eastern 60 acres for the bank. Silas poured a cup of black coffee. He walked to the window. He looked out over the frozen yard. He had made his peace with it. He would lose the creek. He would lose the best grazing land. The ranch would be crippled. But he wasn't broken. A month ago, losing that dirt would have killed him. It would have meant the end of his name, the end of his worth. But he had learned something in the last 4 weeks. A man's worth isn't measured by the acres on his deed. It's measured by what he does when the chips are down. Footsteps sounded behind him, light and steady. Clara walked into the parlor. She wore her faded dress, but she stood different now. The weight was gone from her shoulders. The fear was gone from her eyes. She walked up to the heavy oak table. She placed a plain brown envelope on the wood. Silas turned around. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at her. "What's that?" he asked. "Open it," Clara said. Silas walked over. He picked up the envelope. It was thick. He opened the flap and tipped it into his palm. Gold coins, paper greenbacks, a thick, heavy stack of them. Silas stared at the money. He knew exactly what it was. It was $180, the bank draft from the wooden box. She had gone into town. She had cashed it. He set the money back on the table. He pulled his hand away like the paper was burning hot. "No," Silas said. His voice was hard. "I told you, Clara. I don't want your pity. And I don't take charity. You need that money for Caleb and Abigail. You need it to start over. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She stepped right up to the table. She put her hands flat on the wood. Silas Vance, you listen to me, Clara said. Her voice was sharp, cutting right through his pride. I was a school teacher. I know how to count, and I know the difference between a handout and an investment. She tapped her finger on the stack of bills. Explicit value. Spoken. We don't do charity in this house, Clara said firmly. Charity makes a person beholden. A trade makes a person equal. I am not giving you this money to save your pride. I am buying 40 acres of the eastern tract. The 40 acres with the creek. Silas blinked. The hard edge in his chest faltered. You're buying it. Yes, I'm buying it. Fair and square. She looked him dead in the eye. I want to start a market garden. The soil down by the creek is rich. I can grow winter squash, turnips, cabbage. I can sell it in Kendall, but I need the land to do it. And you need this cash to pay off Amos Thorne and keep the bank off your back. Silas looked at her. Really looked at her. She wasn't a desperate widow begging for a roof anymore. She was a businesswoman, a partner. She was offering a lifeline, but she was doing it in a way that kept both of them standing tall. 40 acres for $180, Silas said slowly. That's a steep price for unplowed dirt. It's the exact price you need, Clara countered, and it's the exact dirt I want. We draw up a contract. We sign it as equals. Two independent people making an honest trade. Silas looked at the money. He looked out the window toward the eastern ridge. He thought about Amos Thorne. He thought about the bank. Then he looked back at the woman standing in front of him. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The respect in his eyes was absolute. He reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. He dipped the nib in the inkwell. I'll draw it up, Silas said. But you get 50 acres, not 40. You'll need the extra space when the boy gets older. Clara watched him write. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips. Deal. Winter broke fast that year. By late March, the frost was gone. The Texas sun baked the mud into a rich, dark brown. The creek ran high and clear. Silas and Clara were down in the eastern 50. They were turning the soil, preparing the ground for Clara's market garden. Silas had the heavy iron plow hitched to the roan. He gripped the wooden handles. The muscles in his back strained as the blade cut deep into the earth. Clara walked a few paces behind. She carried a burlap sack of seeds. She dropped them into the fresh furrows. Caleb walked beside her, carefully covering the seeds with his boots. It was hard, punishing work. The kind of work that breaks a man if he is doing it alone. But Silas wasn't alone. The rhythm of the work felt good. It felt like a promise. Whoa, Silas called out. He pulled back on the reins. The roan stopped, snorting in the warm air. The plow blade had caught on something. It rang out, sharp and dull at the same time. Not a tree root, not a loose field stone. Silas wiped the sweat from his brow. He walked around to the front of the plow. He knelt in the dirt. Clara walked up behind him. Did you hit bedrock? No, Silas said. He started digging with his bare hands. Too flat, too even. He cleared the dirt away. It was a stone, all right, but it was square. Cut by hand, he dug his fingers under the edge. Give me a hand here. Caleb, the boy, ran over. Together, the man and the boy heaved. The heavy stone slab tipped upward, breaking suction with the wet earth. They hauled it out of the furrow and let it drop onto the grass. It was a grave marker or a cornerstone. It was old. The edges were weathered smooth by time and rain. It had been buried here a long time, decades. Clara knelt down in the grass. She took the hem of her apron. She wiped the caked mud from the flat face of the stone. Letters began to appear, chiseled deep into the rock. Silas knelt beside her. They read the words together. This land belongs to J, M, and C. R, 1857, until the day we no longer share the hunger. The wind rustled through the pecan trees. Silas stared at the carving. 1857, 21 years ago. Before the war. Before Silas ever bought the deed. Before Elias Hayes ever signed an X. Two people, J.M. and C.R. They had stood on this exact spot. They had fought the dirt. They had fought the winter. They had starved here, and they had made a pact. The land didn't belong to the man with the most money. It didn't belong to the man with the best lawyers. It belonged to the people who shared the hunger. It belonged to the people who refused to let each other starve. History was repeating itself. This land was tamed by compassion in a time of desperation. It had been lost to greed, and now it had been saved by compassion once again. Clara reached out. Her fingers traced the rough, chiseled letters. She didn't say anything. She just looked at Silas. Silas met her eyes. He understood. The deed in his lockbox was just paper. The contract they signed in the kitchen was just ink. The real ownership was right here. In the dirt, in the sweat, in the choice to stand side by side when the world tried to pull them apart. Silas stood up. He reached down and offered his hand to Clara. She took it. He pulled her up. He didn't let go of her hand. He looked at Caleb. Go fetch some water from the creek, son. The horse is thirsty, and so are we. Yes, sir, Caleb said. He grabbed the wooden bucket and took off running. Silas looked back at the stone. Then he looked at the plow. We leave the stone right there, Silas said. At the head of the garden. Good reminder. A reminder of what? Clara asked softly. That we don't own the dirt, Silas said. We just borrow it. And the dirt favors folks who know how to share. He picked up the plow handles. He clicked his tongue. The roan stepped forward. The blade cut a fresh line into the earth. Dawn broke clear and bright. It was a true spring morning. The kind that smells like wet grass and new beginnings. Silas was out by the western boundary. The wooden fence posts were rotting near the bottom. He was pulling them out, setting new ones. He wasn't working alone. Caleb stood next to him. The boy was holding a canvas pouch full of heavy iron nails. Every time Silas swung the hammer, Caleb had the next nail ready. He didn't act like a servant trying to please a master. He stood tall. He was learning a trade. He was a partner in the work. A few yards away, Clara and Abigail were walking along the fence line. They were gathering dry kindling for the morning fire. Abigail was laughing at a jackrabbit darting through the brush. Clara was smiling. It was a real, easy smile. Silas drove the last nail into the crossrail. He let the hammer drop. He leaned against the sturdy new post. He looked over his land. It wasn't a kingdom. It wasn't a fortune, but it was whole. He turned his head. Hanging on the top rail of the fence, catching the early morning sun, was the heavy leather bag. It was the same bag he had carried out to the cellar months ago. The bag that had held a heavy iron padlock. The bag that had held a loaded Colt revolver. The bag that had carried the rigid, unyielding weight of a man defending his property with violence. Silas reached out. He unbuckled the leather strap. He reached his hand inside. He didn't pull out a gun. He didn't pull out a foreclosure notice. He pulled out a handful of bright golden seed corn. The old weapons of isolation and pride were gone. The bag held life now. It held the future. Silas poured the seeds back into the bag. He buckled it shut. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara and the little girl walking back toward the house. Blood didn't make a family out here. The law didn't make a family. You made a family by choosing each other, by dropping the heavy bags you carried, by sitting in the dark together, by splitting the food and splitting the work and sharing the hunger. All right, Caleb, Silas said. He picked up his hammer. His voice was warm, carrying over the open plain. "Let's head in. Breakfast is waiting." The boy grinned. They fell into step beside each other. They walked back toward the house, toward the smoke rising from the chimney, toward the woman standing on the porch, waiting for them to come home. This fictional story may include themes of romance, betrayal, violence, hardship, or emotional distress that could be sensitive for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised, as the purpose of these scenes is to create dramatic tension and emotional depth within the narrative world.
And so the plowblade found the stone. And the stone said what no deed, no court, and no bank ledger had ever said clearly enough. This land belongs to the people who share the hunger, not the people who hoard it, not the people who wall it off with barbed wire and legal language and the cold, rigid authority of a courthouse seal. The people who share the hunger. Silas Vance had spent 20 years believing that property was the measure of a man. He believed that rules were the architecture of civilization, that a signed deed was as close to sacred as anything printed on paper could get. And in that frozen cellar, holding a heavy leather bag with a padlock and a loaded gun inside, he learned in a single, breathless moment that all of that was nothing, absolutely nothing, next to two children shivering in the dirt over a fistful of feed corn. The first truth this story presses into your hands is one the frontier tried very hard to keep secret. The law and justice are not the same thing. Silas Vance was a lawful man. He bought his deed legally. He paid his debts. He followed the rules. And every single one of those rules was built by men who could read, men who had money, men who knew how to work a courtroom the way a carpenter works a piece of wood, shaping it until it served them. Elias Hayes could not read. He signed an X on a paper he didn't understand, and the law called that a contract. It called it fair. It called it done. And Silas, who was not a cruel man, simply walked away with the land because the rules said he could. This story asks us to sit with the discomfort of that. It asks us to look honestly at the systems we benefit from and ask ourselves not just whether we broke the rules, but whether the rules themselves were ever designed to be fair. Silas tore up his own floorboards to find a truth that could ruin him. He handed that truth to the woman who deserved it because he finally understood that being lawful and being just are two entirely different things. And a man of genuine integrity chooses justice, even when the law would let him choose otherwise. The second truth belongs to Clara. She walked onto that ranch carrying a secret, a lawsuit, and $180 she refused to spend, because spending it meant surrendering her father's name to a man who stole it with fine print and a frightened signature. She chose hunger over surrender. She chose pride over comfort, not out of stubbornness, but out of love. She was fighting for a man who could not fight for himself. She was fighting for every person who has ever been told by the powerful machinery of the law that they don't matter, that they can't understand, that they should just sign on the line and be grateful. And when she finally stood in that courtroom with the gavel in her hand, she set it down. Not because she was weak, but because she understood something most people never learn, that justice is not about winning. It is about restoring what was taken. Her father's dignity was restored. That was enough. She didn't need the dirt. She needed the truth acknowledged, and she needed a man who would choose her humanity over his own survival. She found both. The third truth is the one chiseled into the old stone at the head of the garden. The dirt favors folks who know how to share. Every great myth of the frontier was built on the idea of the lone wolf, the solitary man, the self-made rancher, the rugged individual who needed nobody and owed nothing. This story dismantles that myth with a dropped leather bag and a tin plate of beans divided into 4 equal portions. Silas didn't sit at the head of the big table. He pulled his chair up to the small one. He served Caleb and Abigail the same food he served himself. He ate with them, not above them. That small, silent act, that refusal to be the master at the feast, was more revolutionary than anything a court could have handed down. It said, "You are not less." It said, "Poverty is not a moral failing." It said, "A man who uses his privilege to lift others up is more powerful than a man who uses it to push them down." Silas didn't just save a family from starvation. He saved them from the worst kind of hunger, the hunger to be seen as human. And in the end, when the spring came and the plow turned the earth and the stone rose up from under the soil, everything was said. 2 names, 1 vow, One truth older than any deed and older than any law. We don't own the dirt, we borrow it. And the only rent worth paying is this, that we leave it kinder than we found it, that we hand it forward to children who stand tall and look the world in the eye, that we carry our heavy bags out into the frozen dark, not to threaten and not to defend, but to feed whoever is waiting in the cold. Some of us are Silas, gripping the rules so hard our knuckles bleed because the rules are all we have left. Some of us are Clara, clutching a piece of paper that is worth everything and costs everything, fighting a war that the world says we were never supposed to win. And some of us are Caleb, just a boy standing next to a man with a hammer, learning what it looks like when a grown person chooses right over easy. Drop the bag, sit at the small table, divide the food, share the hunger. That is the only deed that ever truly holds.